All right. So I'd like to introduce Dina Heath, who's going to talk to us about her research in relation to some objects in the Liverpool World Museum. Okay, so over to you, Dina.
Okay, well, I'll just introduce myself a bit more and tell you a bit more about what I do. So I'm a historian who works on colonial India. And my research these days focuses on really grim stuff to do with colonial violence. So I'm interested in the various forms, the nature of violence in empire. And by that, I mean not just acts that were committed by individuals, things like massacres or genocides, but I'm interested in things like structural violence, so economic violence, to do with, economic exploitation and things like that. So I've just finished a book on torture in colonial India. So I deal with a lot of gruesome things. And as a result of that, it's given me, I think, a fairly unique perspective on empire. And I say fairly unique because for the most part, the scholarship of empire really has yet to seriously engage with issues relating to empire and violence. So in British historiography, for example, empire is seen as quite benign. There's little interrogation of what does it really take to colonize a quarter of the world's population, right? And the acts of conquest, the size of the armies, the militaries, the constant skirmishes, the power that it takes to keep people oppressed who don't wish to be ruled by autocratic states, that sort of thing. So British historiography has not been good on dealing with that. Colonial historians, so those who work on former colonies, as in my case, working on India, have been much better at that and thinking about the nature of empire and its impact on not just the people colonized, but the colonizers as well. And actually, if we're going to talk today about museums and objects in museums, what we're looking at in many ways is the way that empire has shaped culture in Britain, from the very foundation of museums themselves to how we relate, or ideas about Britishness, and how we relate to other parts of the planet. So it's a big topic when we look at museums.
But you're focusing in on a particular museum, aren't you? So in a way, it's a big topic, but it's through a prism of one particular museum that happens to be the museum that we go to normally if we're not in lockdown. So yeah, in many ways, this can be a guided tour around the museum that we would normally visit, but obviously we can't. So you're facilitating it digitally for us.
There's many exciting things about World Museums. So it is one of the 7, so it's 8, isn't it, National Museums Liverpool. So it's a national museum, as in the case of the big museums in London, the Natural History Museum, the British Museum, the Victoria and Albert, and so on. It's part of that national complex of museums. But it's doing really interesting and exciting things in terms of rethinking how it represents many of its collections, particularly to do with empire. So they've been working on, rethinking that a lot and doing events related to that. And it's through their activities that I've become involved with the museum. So, the event that you went to, John, that I did last year with them, which was on thinking through the violent histories of many objects in the museum's collections. And so the list of objects that I'm going to talk to you about today is from that event we did for the Being Human Festival last year, called Untold Histories of Empire. And what I want to do is to broaden understandings of violence, so beyond a simple act like a conquest or an army invading or whatever the case may be, and think about how that structured empire and how that makes objects in museums or how they have what scholars refer to as difficult histories. So they're presented in museums in an often really benign way, in which the nature of their acquisition is not discussed, it's not mentioned in museum displays, but that this is an important thing that we should be thinking about.
Okay.
And so World Museum is doing a good job right now of trying to rethink those issues.
I'll just ask a question that I'm thinking about. Do you think that's because it is in Liverpool, and you've also got the Slavery Museum in Liverpool? Or do you think it's a more national thing that's going on at the moment?
I think it's because it's in Liverpool.
Okay.
And I think, yeah, I mean, there are things going on elsewhere, down south, so to speak, at the big museums, but very, very slow on this front. They, understandably, because there is a strong link between museums and the nation state and conceptions of Britishness, right? These are sources of national pride, and the things in them are seen as part of British culture. And so questioning the history of those things, to the extent that, one of the questions that comes up is, should a lot of this stuff not be in Britain? Should it be returned to the origin communities from where it was either taken or acquired through processes of unequal exchange? And if we start opening up that door, if you think of an entity the size of the British Museum, Natural History Museum, V&A,
Yeah.
museums worry that their collections will be gutted. What will be left? The answer to that from those who would like to see museums start doing this is that actually only a tiny percentage of what museums have is on display. So, there's room for returning a lot. So that is one reason. So there's multiple reasons why I think museums in London in particular are reluctant to go down this route. But in Liverpool, yes. I mean, we're in the north. It has a very complex history, as we've seen recently, in relation to the south, right? That classic north-south divide. It itself, there's a sense of being colonized, isn't there, in the north, being colonized by the south, and it's not so much under public scrutiny, and so it can get away with things in terms of rethinking the museum that I think are harder elsewhere.
Yeah, so got more freedom of expression, perhaps.
Yeah, freedom of opportunity, to do, I think, some exciting things.
All right. So shall we move on to the objects?
Okay. So let me just tell you a little bit about World Museum and the particular objects that I'm focusing on. So we have to start by thinking about this name, World Museum, right? What on earth does that mean? It encompasses the nature of this particular museum. So it is what we call an encyclopedic museum. So this concept of the encyclopedic museum is really coming out of 18th century and even a bit earlier than that, ideas that were a product of the Enlightenment in Europe about the world, that all the world was knowable, that all the world could be, in a sense, that knowledge could be mastered and harnessed for the benefit and interests of Europeans. And so it's encompassing an idea that actually this does in some way represent the world. You can bring the world and stick it in a museum. And then, people from Britain and other people who visit it then can engage with the globe. And, that's problematic on so many levels because, of course, its collections are products of the history of the museum and what was donated to it or how they were acquired. And so they represent a specific history. There's big gaps. There's issues with interpretations. I mean, why is it that World Museum actually only includes, when it comes to cultural objects largely by non-Western peoples? Because European objects end up in other museums. They're seen as, more serious, museums. World Museum then is considered ethnographic, right, in terms of the collections from other parts of the world. So we have to actually think about the conceit of a museum like this to claim to be encompassing the world, and then to really think, well, what does that mean? And so bear that in mind when we go through and look at the objects. And in fact, it's worth saying that this thinking about an encyclopedic museum and the sort of power dynamic that represents also requires thinking not just about the objects they own, but how they are displayed. So in World Museum's history, until I think something like the 1970s, objects were displayed. There were changes in how objects were displayed. But until relatively recently, in other words, they were displayed with, according to European notions of racial hierarchy, with cultures that were considered to be the most advanced in European terms, displayed at the top of the museum, and other cultures ranking below that. So museums then are products of their time, culture, and place, and we have to think of them that way in terms of understanding the objects in them and how those objects are displayed.
So you're actually referring to the different floors of the museum, aren't you? And the different subject areas and different human groups that were dealt with on each floor.
Yeah.
And then the visitor would literally move through a progression and move up through a progression from, I don't know, what less progressive to more progressive human groups.
Civilization. So this is coming out of 19th century ideas, European ideas about race and the hierarchy of races, which were themselves a product of empire. So Europeans perceived themselves to be at the top of civilization, that the highest, most civilized people on earth, and other peoples were ranked accordingly below that. And so that conception was mirrored in the layout of the museum itself.
So the actual building and the way the relationship between the objects in the building and the building itself is presenting an idea, and people are moving through a particular idea of the world and a particular idea of people and how they relate to each other.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's what all museums do. Museums spend huge amounts of time thinking not just about how to display their collections, but how people move through those spaces. And that is part of giving you an experience as a museum visitor. So they are constructing narratives through their objects, narratives about, in this case, in a case of a museum like World Museum, about the past.
So it's like an immersive experience, isn't it? Something like, we would perhaps now think of virtual reality as an immersive experience, but actually entering a museum and moving through a museum in a sort of predefined route and being informed about objects and observing objects is providing a story that when we leave the museum, it gives us a structure of the past through an actual physical exploration of this particular building and objects.
Yes, definitely.
I know at Manchester, and this is a little bit of an aside, but at Manchester they're doing some really interesting stuff, but they're tied in some ways because the actual structure of the building is a listed building, and so are the display cases. So even though some of the ideas that they're trying to get across might be trying to disrupt this idea of moving through a space in a linear way, because the structure of the building and the display cases are listed, there's not a lot they can do to change that aspect of it.
Yeah, that's one reason why it can be nice to start from scratch with museums and design something new, right? And there have been some really interesting museums, you know, that have been built in the last 30, 40 years that take into account those issues to do with space and how people move through buildings as part of their design.
Okay.
So should we go on to talk about the object? So what I want to do for you, so I went through World Museum. I was very fortunate. I've been working with the head curator of the World Cultures Collections, Emma Martin, who then is responsible for overseeing all the collections, most of the collections that I'm going to show you today. And we just went through the entire museum and looked at what it had on display. And I wanted to get a sense of what story this museum was telling about empire and what ways we could counter that story. So, or not necessarily counter it, but enrich it, delve deeper into the histories of these collections. And so these, I'm going to show you 10 objects that I selected as part of that process. So I'm just going to start with something like a globe. You'll often see these old globes in British museums in particular seem to have a lot of these from the 18th and 19th centuries, in particular, when owning a globe like this was a sign of, you know, gentlemanly status. It was a sign of intelligence and culture and so on. So you'll often see these sorts of globes. And whenever, if you visit a country house, there will always be a globe like this. But the point is that these globes represented something. And actually what a globe like this does, and what it was designed to do, was represent mastery over the planet. So map making, which we may look at as something fairly benign, was itself a product of empire. As Europeans went out into the world and they started encountering other peoples and then conquering and colonizing many peoples, map making was central to that project because it made it possible to lay claim to particular parts of the globe and then to represent that ownership quite literally on maps. And of course, maps are notoriously, globes are fairly accurate, but we have maps when we get these flat maps that show Britain right in the middle. Right, the globe isn't a rectangle and we aren't in the middle of it, and that demonstrates how maps are associated with power, and you know, and that sense of a mastery over the world. So it gave owners of globes like this that sense of well, you could look at it, and usually, as you can see from this one here, the bits that Britain colonized were colored pink. And so quite literally, you could look at that map and say, well, you know, that's our bit. And so, yeah, again, something like a globe, they're beautiful. I always love maps, but they're not as benign as they look.
You could call it like a very rudimentary surveillance tool.
Yeah. Well, not that rudimentary. In India, for example, the greatest map making project, one of the greatest that's ever taken place, it took 30 years for the British to map the entirety of their territories in India. And it was a vast project, you know, mile by mile, village by village of mapping this, because you can't exploit something. You can't tax it. You can't do all the things that you're actually there to do through empire with a colony unless you know what you've got, unless you've mapped it. You know the terrain, you know how many people are in that terrain, how productive the land is. All of those are tied up, all those issues are tied up with map making.
Okay.
So yeah, just wanted to start you with maps, and then I'm going to talk about two objects together. So I've got here a botany print that's taken from, that was made at the time of Captain Cook's voyages to Australia. And I'll come back to that. And this other image here, object here, a hummingbird. And what on earth, you might ask, do these have to do with your subject matter that you and your students are studying, John, or with empire? Well, the reason I picked these two objects is because empire isn't just about, or wasn't just about, colonizing people, right? It was about colonizing, as we saw with the globe, it was about colonizing land and exploiting land. So with empire went the emergence of science, of many sciences as disciplines, areas of study, botany being among them, zoology. We have museums like the Natural History Museum, places like Kew Gardens, which is a living museum, that are stocked full of plants and animal remains. We have zoos as well from empire. So that quest for knowledge that was part of the Enlightenment fueled much of this interest, but it was also about what can we use here? What crops are of value to us? And in fact, if you look at most of the crops you've eaten in the past week, the top 10 of those are all products of empire, right? All the chips that we eat, the potatoes we scoff, the bananas, etc., that all came through empire and identifying useful crops. And that had a tremendous impact. Entire colonies were transformed into monocultural entities just serving European interests. Colonies like India were deindustrialized and turned into entities again that produced crops for the benefit of Britain and other European countries, particularly cotton. So we can see that with plants, and we can see that with animals as well. And we go to museums and we see stuffed animals and we think, oh, isn't it sweet? And we don't think about this as an act of violence, of the sheer massacring of probably millions of animals in scientific quests. Again, how are they useful to us? How are they unique? What can we get out of this animal, right? And so museums are chock full of these natural history displays, and they're intimately linked to this larger project of empire and the development of science. So how we categorize the natural world, how we understand the natural world. That's, most of that has come initially through empire.
So we categorize and understand it by killing it and then putting it in a museum.
Yeah, I have a 10-year-old who's like a mini David Attenborough, and he has his own, as he calls it, natural history museum, and he's got about 15,000 objects in there that he himself has found. And I was talking to him one day about his museum when he started telling me, you know, this is a museum about empire. I thought, I didn't know what my 10-year-old had to do with that, but what he was saying was, the ways that he organizes his museum, the connections that he sees between different objects in that museum, that he's viewing animal remains as objects to begin with, and all these things, they are products of the sciences that emerged from empire. So they're all intimately connected. So to move on then, I've talked to you a bit about the natural world. I chose this knife because it's one of the few objects in the museum that explicitly refers to the violence related to the natural world, right? So we're all familiar with the tragic decrease in tiger populations. We know tigers are on the brink of extinction. When the British first went to India, for example, it was chock full of tigers. But hunting was seen as the thing for colonial officials, for British civilian, you know, those there on business, etc., to do. It's what European men did. They killed things in often astounding numbers. My recent book on torture in colonial India, I focus on police torture. So I read an awful lot of memoirs by police officials, British police officials in India, and every single one of them was into hunting and talks about their hunting and the tigers they've killed and the leopards they've killed and so on. So the act of killing became associated with a particular model of masculinity. So we can actually trace ideas about masculinity as well to empire. And so that tied to masculinity, but here we have an actual object used for carrying that out. And what I find disturbing about this object is it's made out of tiger bone. So it was made out of the very animal that it was used to kill for. So, you know, the estimation, I've got it written here, of the number of tigers that the British in India killed in the 200 years or so that they were involved in colonizing India is 50,000. It's huge. So we then turn these animals, this is an example of how we turn the natural world into material artifacts. These are objects, and this is an object on the one hand of beauty and it's horrifying on the other, right?
And I remember when you showed this object when I did the tour with you, and it's actually got, is it the story of the hunt written on the handle of the knife?
I think it does. I couldn't magnify enough to read what it says from the image that I have, but yes, and I think it's got the owner's name on it as well.
Yeah, that what you're talking about there with the violence, it's an ongoing debate, isn't it, in this country to do with hunting, and the kinds of people who see it as it's important to protect hunting as a sort of part of our culture, and yeah, the other side of the argument that's suggesting it's an outmoded and barbaric practice and an elitist practice as well. So it's interesting you're talking about colonialism, but there's also the issue in this country currently that's a parallel debate, really.
It is, but again, this is tied to certain, I mean, hunting in Britain, obviously it's not tied as clearly to models of masculinity. It's tied to models of masculinity and femininity linked to class, right? Yeah. Because it's an aspirational thing to do, to go out and kill little animals, right? Yeah, and so it's, but when important thing to realize about empire, when I mentioned it at the beginning, I think I mentioned this at the beginning, with empire, we tend to think of its effects flowing one way. In other words, Britain or the Netherlands or France or whoever the case may be went out, conquered places, colonized them, and the cultural exchange went one way. The effects of that went one way. And it doesn't work that way. The effects flowed back because the acts that Europeans were doing in empire shaped conceptions of themselves. They shaped conceptions of emerging nation states. So I would trace these ideas about hunting, not all of them, but they're very much tied to ideas coming out of empire. This is what elite men in empire did. You killed things and you stuck the heads and other bits up as trophies, and that's why every country house that you visit in Britain will have tons of these. Some of them have horrific numbers, and it's depicted as, you know, an act of glory that this tiger or leopard or whatever is there.
Yeah.
So yes, if you've ever wondered about tigers being on the edge of extinction, that's one reason why. So I included this object here of a skull. This is actually not a human remain. It is a cast of a skull, which is interesting why the museum would want a cast of a human skull on display. Because the displaying, I'm going to show you some human remains, another set of human remains that I included in the exhibition. What we refer to as an Egyptian mummy, and don't think that it is actually a human body. But until relatively recently, museums were full of human remains, and they were a way of explaining and justifying European ideas about race. So World Museum, for example, has a series of skulls that demonstrate different human species. So the evolution of human species. I think there's also some animal skulls and then a modern human. So on the one hand, this is fascinating from an anthropological perspective, but if we think about it as an artifact, as an object, and the story that object is telling, it's also tying into those notions about hierarchy and race, right? Because there were these backward humans, and now we have the modern ones. And until recently, museums had skulls from different peoples. So they would, you know, put those alongside skulls of Europeans. Would they put them alongside skulls of Europeans? I'm actually not 100% sure about that point, but they would certainly display skulls from people from different parts of the world. And in the 19th century, this pseudoscience called phrenology emerged. And according to this, and I say pseudoscience because it's got no scientific basis whatsoever, but what phrenology entailed was there were these measuring tools that were used to measure the skull. So you'd measure different parts of the skull, the size of the eye sockets, whether there were bumps on the head. And according to these tools, that then explained racial characteristics. So first of all, skulls were tied to notions of race, which it's not a scientific thing, race. Right? It's a cultural understanding. And then certain characteristics that were related but perceived to belong to certain peoples were then tied quite literally to their biology. So when we talk about scientific racism, biological racism, we're talking quite literally about how bodies were understood and transformed into objects. And again, this was used to justify empire, because we have a right to conquer and colonize these peoples because they're backward and inferior. And look how similar this skull is to a Neanderthal skull, for example.
The analogy you've just used there, I was going to bring it up, that in prehistoric archaeology, it's a similar thing, that people in the past were perceived as progressing to end up as us. Europeans. And so I was in a museum, I was in the Manchester Museum actually about 2 months ago, but also in London. And you still get things like Neanderthal skulls or other human types in the past, along with what's termed modern human skulls. So it might not be Europeans, but what's now termed modern human. And but it was the same narrative, that you can see a progression to where we are now.
Yeah. So that's exactly what these skulls were used for. And it's worth thinking about a display like this in a museum. So to move on to objects that perhaps relate more to the interest of you and your students, I wanted to include objects that we look at as aesthetic objects. So we look at an object like this, which is a head of a Buddha sculpture, and it's beautiful, and it's displayed in World Museum as an object of beauty. But what's written out of that is, if you look at it again, it's a severed head, right? And it's, you know, displayed on a plinth as a severed head. Why is it a severed head? That sort of story is not usually included in museum accounts of objects. So a lot of objects like this bear the marks of the violence of their acquisition on them, but museums rarely acknowledge those marks. So I think the museum doesn't know the story of these particular heads. It has 3 of them. But these come from what is today northwest Pakistan, the Punjab region of Pakistan. And yes, these were often taken, quite literally, they could be looted by soldiers, knowing that there was a good market for them back home. So literally hacked off of temple walls. They could be taken by archaeologists, because archaeology is also, as a discipline, emerged again through empire as a way of asserting knowledge and mastery and control over material culture, right? We know the value of this, you don't. We're going to interpret it for you, that sort of thing. And so sometimes they were taken by archaeologists. But the point is that in places like World Museum, British Museum, I think, has some heads like this. They're displayed simply as art, and the complex histories, the violent histories of their acquisition, or even the violence inherent on display in the object itself, isn't talked about. I didn't know if you wanted to come in there.
Yeah, I'm aware of the time as well, though.
Okay, all right, I'll carry on.
Yeah.
So again, to think about violent objects, you'll often see items like this, and World Museum has a lot of them. This is a Maori club, so the Maori are indigenous peoples of New Zealand. Museums are chock full of what are referred to as ethnographic objects that represent the cultures of non-Western peoples. But these peoples are often represented through objects like this, a spear, or think about Japan. It's always represented solely through samurai and samurai swords. And one of the reasons that museums have so many collections of objects like this is because, again, it's a way of justifying empire. Because an object like this can be used to say, well, look at how barbaric these people are. You know, they're threatening, they're dangerous. We had to contend with these spears when we got there. And, you know, we've come to civilize. And what it does is it writes out the violence of empire. There are no guns that Europeans used to do their conquering, right, in museums, but they will put the tools that indigenous peoples use to resist those acts in museums. So again, we have to think about what is being represented about particular cultures and why it's being represented. So this one here that I know you particularly wanted me to talk about, John, is rarer for a number of reasons. So it's an object that bears the mark of violence on it. This object was acquired, as in the case of thousands of objects from the African state of Benin, in an absolutely audacious, atrocious act of looting by British troops in Benin in 1897, and they just took thousands of objects of ritual significance, about 2,500 of them. But in the course of this rampage of looting, a fire started in the palace, the king's palace in Benin, and many objects were damaged. And so the looting of Benin became bounty for museums across Europe. There are dozens of museums that have remnants, aspects of this collection, and some of them do bear this is charred marks on this item. So this is an example. This is an example not just of a looted, violated object, but in this case, the museum discusses that in its displays. So it actually does quite a good job of dealing with that difficult history and talking about it in relation to the object. But the trickier issue is that Nigeria, of which the former state of Benin is now a part, has been asking museums to return these objects for decades. And so far, not much has been returned. So yes, the museum is grappling with although the World Museum is one of the first, I think it's the first national museum in Britain to develop an object repatriation policy. So its goal is, in fact, to return a lot of objects like this if claims are made.
I think when we talked about it before we started, I think the reason I find this object really interesting is because of, as you've highlighted, the looted objects paid for the actual colonization process. So I think I mentioned that's something that Stuart Campbell has talked about as well. The sort of economy that's associated with these objects that, again, doesn't really get discussed when we look at an object in a museum.
There's a wonderful film. I don't know if you've seen it, but I heartily recommend it to you and your students. It's a French film from the 1970s. In English, it's called Black and White in Color. And it's one of the best films about colonialism that's ever been made. And I won't tell you the plot. It involves these long forgotten about colonies in equatorial Africa, one German, one French, who discover that France and Germany are at war. And they discover it like 3 months after the war has started, because they're out in the middle of nowhere. And there's like 6 of them in each of the outposts on either border. And it deals also with this issue of collecting and how that works, because there are some missionaries there who, let's say, their motive is less than godly. And what they do is they go about procuring objects. So I suppose these, they don't just fuel empire and further conquest and so on. They I don't know, they enrich the church in that case. They have their effects multiply in terms of wealth and cultural meaning. So it's a brilliant film. And then the last, I think these are my last 2 statues. Yeah, so I could talk about these 2 together. Now, every child loves going to a museum to see Egyptian artifacts. I mean, they're amazing, they're exciting. They're still a hot sell. World Museum has an entire Egyptian floor. I mean, it has so many Egyptian artifacts. That is partly because of the history of the Museum of Liverpool. And we had some well-known archaeologists here. We have our own museum as well that contains some of these collections. But we don't stop to think, why on earth do Western museums have so much Egyptian stuff? Why is it all in there? Why do we value it? And what does it signify? So it's become wrapped up with a narrative, the sort of Indiana Jones idea of the valiant European archaeologist. They're generally male, right? So again, ideas of masculinity tied up with that, who goes out to these threatening places and, you know, valiantly unearths objects that are of value to global culture, etc. Which isn't the way things worked. Most of these objects were, you know, it was peoples in Egypt who knew where these things were, who did all the digging, the scouting, the everything. And then the European came along, and in this case of this particular object here, stamped their name on it. He carved his name on it to say, this is mine. It's got Belzoni on it. And I own this. And so, yes, there's a lot that could be said about the looting of Egypt, quite literally. And in this case, we're not so much talking about armies going in and looting, or the type of looting I was talking about with the Buddhist heads. This is more problematic, isn't it? Because it's an appropriation of cultural heritage, usually through unequal means. So Egypt was actually never formally a British colony, but it was incorporated as part of the empire from the 1880s for about 40 years. So, you know, these digs, these archaeological excavations took place in terms of very unequal relations between Britain and Egypt and these renowned archaeologists who were going off and doing all the digging. And then a lot of questions remain about them dragging all this stuff back to Britain and often making a lot of money out of them. And, you know, none of these objects I think are as problematic as what we call mummies. We've just had Halloween. We didn't get to see all the mummies out on the street this year. I love Halloween. I love seeing the kids dressed up. Of course, this is still a common kind of costume, bandages and some mask, right? And so we call these mummies, and they're very exciting to see. And we don't stop to think, this is a human remain here. This is a body. And why is it okay to have an Egyptian body on display and not other bodies? Would we put our grandmother up here in the museum, right? Or something like that, right? So I chose this particular human remain because we know this person's name, Paddy Amon. In fact, some details about his life are known, but also because, again, an object like this, we view it, if we're going to be generous, as a way of understanding ancient Egyptian culture. But these objects were viewed, remains were viewed as something exciting and scandalous from the very moment that Europeans started collecting them. And so a common feature, and it was done in museums, or there would be sort of unveiling events that archaeologists would do, and they would dramatically break open caskets or unwrap mummies to show what was underneath. And that was done in this particular case. And I think it still bears objects in it. I think there's a small pair of scissors or remnants of that unwrapping. And so to me, this is very stark. It's very visceral seeing this particular remain. So this was unwrapped in 1851, but as I've noted here, such performances took place at World Museum as late as 1966. So yes, we should really rethink why it is okay that we continue to have human remains like this on display when it is no longer seen as acceptable to put human remains on display. And museums have had to think about this a lot. I'm sure you've been to the Pitt Rivers Museum.
I've not, but I know the Pitt Rivers.
Yeah, which has things like shrunken heads on display. And so again, they've had to think about why do we have them here? What is this showing about the cultures we're claiming to represent? There are all sorts of questions about putting these objects on display.
I think the thing, that struck me about this one when I was reading through it was the performative aspect, and how it's almost like the performance in terms of performing the idea of exploring this shocking thing for the first time, when in fact it's obviously been done a number of times already. So it's not as though it's scientific research, it's much more about the experience, sharing the experience of doing it, or demonstrating the ability to do it.
Yeah, but I think that's the case. We are perhaps too generous in what we refer to as scientific research. I mean, if you look at empire, and I gave you the example of phrenology, for example, we just have to think about science in relationship to empire and how that is framed. And science itself, various disciplines in science have been shaped by those ideas, discourses, practices. So I don't think it should surprise us that there was this. What is a museum itself? It's a museum in many ways of science, of a museum like this. It's an homage to, yes, I guess I said at the beginning, mastery over the world and understanding of the world. And that's got some showmanship to it right there, to stick them in a museum and go to all this trouble to put them on display like this and so on. So yeah.
So to sort of conclude, because I know that you're pushed for time, you said right at the beginning before we started about how you find it quite exciting that these are different ways of looking at things that we may not have come across before, and we might already have formulated ideas. I was just wondering if you could just reiterate that on while we're recording it, the concept.
Yeah. To me, the exciting thing about history, you often hear ideas about history, for example, in relation to the recent Black Lives Matter protests, you know, when protesters dumped a statue into the into a canal, and it, you know, there were responses to that. Oh my God, it's horrid, and we can't possibly reinterpret this statue because it was made at a certain time and it was put in this place, and that meaning is fixed forever, right? But history isn't like that. The meaning of the past changes according to the questions that we ask of it. And so what history, what academic history strives to do is it's through the process of asking new questions. And those new questions come out of cultural events, changing notions. They come out of historians debating ideas, and so on. So for me, looking at objects in new ways, or thinking about them, how they got there, why they're there, how they're displayed, it's interesting, it's exciting. It's not about one of the reasons that there's an uncomfortable feeling about thinking about empire in Britain is a sense of shame, that we should feel guilty about empire. I always tell students, you had nothing to do with this. This is the past. But what we have an obligation to do in the present is understand that past and negotiate its legacies. So we can't just let things sit and rot forever and take and hold the same meanings they held to people a century ago or 2 centuries ago. Those meanings change. And for me, that's an exciting, positive thing. It doesn't erase previous understandings, it adds new layers.
But I suppose if you're a first year student in either archaeology or history at Liverpool, perhaps it's your new ideas that will be the ones that present a new meaning to these objects.
Absolutely. Everybody comes to these.
It's okay for us to talk about it, but what I mean is, from a lot, you know, the ideas that are brought are not just by people looking backwards, they're also by new people coming into the disciplines with new perspectives. And I suppose what you're saying, and what I'd like to reiterate, is that all our ideas are important, but they need to be thought out clearly and be able to justify and support them. Right. It's not just a case of bringing new ideas, but at the same time, that's how we do develop a better understanding of things.
And it takes time. For example, the book that I have in press now on torturing colonial India, that took 10 years. Because, of course, it requires understanding. To talk about something like colonial violence, for example, there are so many areas of study that I had to look at the literatures on, and then do archival research in different countries, India and in Britain, and then draw new conclusions. That book will come out. Other scholars will come along, will respond to that. It might push understandings of empire and violence in new ways. I hope it will. And that's how new ideas emerge. And so, yes, it has to be, it's great having new ideas. It's why we teach, right? We love being around young people and hearing those ideas, because they're the ones who are going to take all this forward. But of course, it has to be grounded in the scholarship and understandings of what's there.
All right, shall we draw it to a close?
We will. I do have to dash.
All right, thanks very much, Dina. It's really appreciated, and it is very interesting. So thanks very much.
Oh, great. It was good talking to you.